What happens when a government stops protecting a community and becomes the source of its oppression? Well, this is the case of the Tostil, Testal, Tojolabal, and Chol communities that formed the Zapatista Army of National Liberation in Chiapas, Mexico. But the Zapatista uprising wasn't just a reaction to NAFTA in 1994, it was the result of centuries of injustice instead. By the late 20th century, these inequalities deepened. The Mexican government adopted neoliberal reforms to recover from an economic crisis, joining the global market through NAFTA.
The 1992 reform of Article 27 privatized communal lands, turning collective land into property for sale. For indigenous communities, it felt like colonialism redesigned for a global market.
Radio Zapata, la voz oficial del Frente Suroriental del EZLN, Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional.
On January 1, 1994, the EZLN rose up demanding justice and land. It wasn't only a rebellion, it was a collective scream for autonomy and a demand to be recognized.
To understand the Zapatista movement, we must first understand the historical context, because the oppression did not appear out of nowhere. It was a result of centuries of exclusion during the Spanish colonization, because indigenous people were taken from their lands and pushed into a system like encomiendas and haciendas, because power stayed in the hands of the colonial elites, while indigenous communities suffer exploitation. When the independence happens, did not change. Value economic growth over the indigenous right. Trade progress as profit and ignore indigenous voices in the name of development. When NAFTA happened, it was a sign that it represents the continue of the old patterns. It was another decision made about indigenous people without letting them participate and raising their voices.
Hay un punto común de enlace para los problemas nacionales, que para un sector u otro coinciden siempre en el de falta de libertad y falta de democracia.
When we talk about the Zapatista uprising, we're talking about a long silence on indigenous communities for centuries. After independence, Mexico promised progress, but that progress often looked almost identical to the past. Government modernization and neoliberal reforms repeated colonial structures, prioritizing private property, foreign investment, and centralized political power while ignoring indigenous autonomy. Poverty and inequality in Chiapas are not accidental, they are historical. Invisible power kept indigenous voices out of decision-making spaces, especially under the PRI, where political control was tightly centralized. The movement showed the world how neoliberalism, despite promising prosperity, reinforced the same colonial patterns of land disposal and political exclusion.
Understanding the Zapatista movement requires looking at the intersection between economics and politics. After the 1982 crisis, Mexico turned toward neoliberal reforms to stabilize the economy. But these decisions weakened small farmers and indigenous communities the most. When NAFTA came into effect, cheap U.S. corn rapidly entered Mexico, pushing local farmers out of the market. Over 1 million farmers lost their livelihoods. For indigenous communities, this meant losing land, work, and food security. Politically, the reform of Article 27 privatized communal lands. Land that once belonged to communities was suddenly vulnerable to private purchase or abandonment.
Some scholars see Zapatista autonomy as a potential threat to Mexico's unity. They argue that giving indigenous communities full self-governance could fragment national identity and weaken the authority of the state. Zapatista autonomy apparently operates with, against, and beyond the state. In other words, it both cooperates with and challenges government power, and that's what creates tension. Critics fear that autonomous zones in Chiapas could make it harder for Mexico to maintain national laws, order, and stability. But Zapatista autonomy doesn't reject democracy, it redefines it. Rather than trying to dismantle the state, the EZLN exposes its limits and proposes a new kind of democracy to one that's more inclusive.
The Zapatistas have never tried to separate from Mexico. What they wanted is simple: to be heard and to manage their own resource failure. Their autonomous communities already show that local autonomy and national unity can coexist. They built participatory governments that Mexico's centralized system has often failed to offer. So, yes, they challenge the state, but not to dismantle it. They challenge it to recognize new ways of government, new ways of sharing power, and a more inclusive kind of democracy.
The idea that indigenous autonomy threatens Mexico unity ignores the deeper root of this conflict. The Zapatista movement didn't emerge to divide the country. It emerged as a response of centuries of exclusion and broken promise. As the demand for autonomy does not mean cessation, it expressed the aspiration of indigenous people to participate equal in political, economical, and cultural life in a nation. Their struggle isn't rejection of democracy, it called to make democracy more inclusive and one that finally recognizes indigenous voices and their rightful place in Mexico history. To conclude, I would like to say that the Zapatista movement shows us that this story is alive, kept alive by those who refuse to be ignored. Every war, every march, every act of resistance reminds us that the dignity cannot be destroyed. The ESL showed that the limit of a kind of progress that ignores inequality and reminds us that the real change begins when we listen to those people who have been pushed aside. To move forward, Mexico must let humanity, dignity, and autonomy go hand in hand.